Hello.
Hello.
You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
I'm Indigo.
And I'm Hilary.
And listeners, we're going to tell it to you, and we're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we're talking about
T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets.
And I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
So first off, we just want to thank everyone that came out for our Blue Velvet event at Row House, especially if any of you are finding us from that. That's very exciting. We got to meet a lot of new people that night. It was such a blast getting to introduce a film that we love so much. We had Colin from Cream Corn in the Universe coming out to visit us. We love you, Colin. It meant so much to have you in town and hanging out with us and coming out to the event. We look forward to potentially doing more events like that in the future. But until then, we've got episodes to keep you busy.
Yes, and we're so excited about this one. We introduced it at the beginning of our last with a vivid description of how Indigo was on a plane preparing for this episode. So
yes, again, I wish I had footage of it because I imagine it looked pretty crazed about how frantically excited I was as I read this for the first time and realized how many connections to Twin Peaks, particularly The Return, that you can see.
Now, the reason we're talking about T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets is because when Audrey Horne first appears in The Return, it's in part 12. And when we first see her, she's standing in front of a piece of furniture. And there are some books on that furniture, among other clutter. Most of these books have no visible titles or distinguishing details, but two are easily identified. The first is a 1940s children's basil reader called Happy Times.
Sounds a lot like Good Times on Our Street.
It sure does. The other book is the one that we're discussing today, and that's the Four Quartets.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've mentioned this before. It's something that I really admire about you is that you are able to really zoom in on details. Listeners, Hilary will see something flash through in a scene and go back and be able to figure out what it is. And that's how we've honestly come to do a lot of these episodes. It's small details that you've noticed. And this was one that you caught.
But that's mostly, I think, we're both book people.
True.
Right? As we're recording here with our microphones on stacks of books.
Yeah.
And so I'm always interested, like, ooh, what books are on the shelves there, even if it's just a set dressing thing.
Right.
And so when I looked at the Four Quartets there on the shelf, I thought, okay, I don't remember reading that, but I just made some quick assumptions based on other Eliot poems. Right. And I was like, okay, I'll just put that on one of my many back burners of my brain, right? But for me, it wasn't until I read John Thorne's book, Ominous Swoosh, that I noticed a footnote where he mentions it in the book. And I think he says something like, whole essays could be written about the connections. And now that was just in a footnote. Right. But that was just the kind of footnote that was right for our show.
And then once we dove in, we realized, oh yeah, we could do whole essays. And in fact, listeners, that's why this is going to be a 2-part episode. So today we're only focusing on half of it. And then we'll do a part 2 where we're going to dive into the second 2 poems.
Yeah, there is just way too much here. And again, we're just beginning the conversation.
Yeah.
I think that
we're just scratching the surface.
We're scratching the surface, and we would encourage and welcome the community's input for sure on this topic.
Please.
So we're going to approach this a little differently, of course, than we usually do our episodes. So one thing, we are going to link to a PDF of the poem in our episode description. And we're going to try to make it really clear where we are in the poem as we discuss.
So, listeners, if you're not familiar with this poem, do not fret, do not worry. We're going to try to make it as accessible as possible for you. Even if you have any trouble just like getting to it in the episode description based on where you're listening to it, you are welcome to message us and we will be happy to send you a PDF of it, because we think that this is something that any Twin Peaks fan should be reading.
So we've studied this poem in two ways. First is as it relates to Twin Peaks The Return, of course. And this is the first way that both of us approached it as readers.
Yeah, and there are so many quick, obvious connections. As soon as you start reading it, you will see exactly what we mean.
The second way we've studied it is as itself, with the help of a lot of articles from academic journals. So the initial goal of this research was really just to have a foundation of understanding of the poems themselves. But happily, this work also led to an even richer appreciation of the book's deep resonances within the return.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think the big thing is like, as we better understand where the themes are coming from, that we saw the connections with Twin Peaks, when we start to go back to Eliot's inspiration and all that kind of stuff, that it just, the connections actually get even stronger.
So as we discuss the text of the poems, we're going to do both of these things. We're going to ground it in a general understanding and analysis of the poems, and also simultaneously connect it with the return.
We're also going to introduce 5 main themes of the Four Quartets that we'll discuss throughout these 2 episodes.
Briefly, though, it's worth noting that the Four Quartets was Eliot's last major work of poetry. The 4 poems were written and published separately from 1936 to 1942, and then they were published as a book in 1943. Eliot considered this to be his best work, and now Four Quartets is widely regarded as a masterpiece.
Yeah, but I know you were surprised in some of your research to discover that it wasn't always universally beloved.
Yeah, I was searching and downloading articles by topic, and I wasn't paying too much attention to the dates. And then I'm reading an article from 1946 that I'm shocked by how negative it was and how many references there were in this article to critics' disappointment and disdain for this book. So the impression I kept getting from this particular article was that a lot of critics believed that it was a work unworthy of the author of The Wasteland.
Which is crazy because we both loved it immediately.
Yeah, and they were unfavorably comparing it to that more canonical poem from 1922. It was really a classic tension between early and late artistic styles that we also see with David Lynch's work.
Yeah. Because, I mean, especially when we think about the ways that people grow as artists, as they get to know themselves better, as they have different experiences and stuff, people need to understand that their work is going to change as well, because it's a representation of themselves and a way to work through the thoughts and ideas that they have as they grow and change.
Absolutely. You know, most of us... certainly you and I.
Yeah.
But I think most people in general, if we've read any of Eliot's poetry, we've probably read The Wasteland.
Right. That was my first big introduction to Eliot, because it was just part of the curriculum in my first year writing seminar in my undergraduate program.
Now, I didn't remember reading the Four Quartets, so I was braced for that kind of effort required by The Wasteland when I opened the book. Instead, I had a really different experience. It was a more intuitive and emotional response, and I don't think it's just because I was thinking about my favorite show.
It really is, listeners, an incredible piece of work, because it is also just largely a big commentary on humanity and humility, and it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, and where reading The Wasteland is an intellectual exercise.
Yes, yeah.
Reading this, I don't want to say it can be a spiritual experience, but
I think it can be.
It is reflecting on spiritual experience.
Yeah.
And I think that you can approach this poem with less confidence as a reader of poetry than you might need to tackle the wasteland.
Yeah, well, and I think a big part of that is, and this is one of the first 5 general themes that we're going to address throughout both episodes of this poem. One of the first big themes is humility. The wasteland is defined by irony. Four Quartets trades that for humility. Eliot's tone is often uncertain and tentative. It's like very gentle. There's a kind of resignation, but also patient determination in the speaker. It feels very right for the tone of Twin Peaks: The Return.
The other thing that overlaps with The Return is Eastern thought. So with these 5 general themes we're focusing on through both episodes, we know there are a lot of different critical approaches to Four Quartets. And so we tried to choose those that had the best overlap with The Return, of course. So with Eastern thought, these poems were written after Eliot's conversion to Anglicanism, and they are full of Christian imagery and allusions. Eliot, though, was also very interested in Eastern religions and philosophies. He stated that the 2 best religious poems were Dante's Divine Comedy and the Bhagavad Gita.
And in our research, we found numerous articles by Indian scholars analyzing the connections between the Four Quartets and works like the Gita and the Upanishads, because Twin Peaks: The Return is clearly more oriented towards Eastern thought than Christianity. We're choosing to focus on this approach to Four Quartets. We are aware of the heavy Christian overtones of the work, but they won't be a main focus of our discussion. When we think about The Return, and we actually talked about this quite a bit in our last episode on Wally Brando, there's a lot of conversation about transcendence and everybody's different path towards that transcendence. And we're going to make some, notes back to that in this episode, or with this 2-part episode as well.
On that note, the third major general theme is mystical development. So Four Quartets was almost certainly influenced by a best-selling book by Evelyn Underhill, which was first published in 1911. It's called Mysticism, a Study in the Nature and Development of Man's Spiritual Consciousness. Now, if that title inclines you to dismiss this as some woo-woo, pause, please pause. Because Underhill was this enormously respected scholar, writer, and lecturer. She was the first woman invited to deliver university-wide lectures at Oxford, and the first woman to lecture the clergy in the Church of England. She was also the first woman to be given a fellowship at King's College. So this was a true scholar.
Yeah, someone very well respected. And Underhill's book, Mysticism, has 2 parts, and the second is particularly relevant to the Four Quartets and to The Return. That's called The Mystic Way, and in it, Underhill delineates the phases of mystical life: awakening, purification, illumination, the dark night of the soul, and finally, union.
In the article, Character and Action in the Four Quartets, the scholar William Moynihan suggests that Underhill's phases of mystical life correspond with the experiences described by the speaker in the poem. So we see a lot of correspondence with The Return in these phases too. So these phases are going to come up a lot in the discussion of the poem.
But the thing is, according to Underhill, the soul doesn't just travel a straight line. It's not just like a yellow brick road through these phases. She emphasizes instead that the road towards reality is an ascending spiral where the soul experiences alternating sun and shade, joy and pain.
And this concept of the spiral is very heavily reflected in Four Quartets. Each of the poem has 5 sections, and across the poems, those sections seem to correspond with each other. So, for example, section 1 in Burnt Norton seems to have some connection to section 1 of East Coker.
And Eliot repeats phrases, too, throughout the poem, giving us a kind of looping or spiral effect in the language. And there's a lot of other ways that this ties into some themes that we noticed. It's a very fluid way of writing, and we think about time being such a fluid thing as well.
I like this quote from Narsingh Srivastana in the article, The Ideas of the Bhagavad Gita in Four Quartets. He puts it this way: The ideas in the Four Quartets are not presented in a pattern of logical analysis. Rather, they are emotionally realized in an intuitive mode of mystical experience. I like that related to this spiral thing, because it isn't the kind of poem that we can analyze in this straight line.
Yeah.
Logical progression of one idea to the other.
Yeah. Which I think is part of what makes it so different from The Wasteland, too.
If you're reading this, you can't expect a narrative that you can follow neatly from experience to experience, one logical point to another.
So this intuitive mode, the spiral of the Four Quartets, can be confusing because it's not a clearly linear story. And that sounds quite a bit like The Return, doesn't it?
Haven't we all heard that David Lynch said that maybe the order in which the events of The Return are presented is not the only way, not the only order of events to watch them in. So, yeah. Okay, our fourth thing, and now these others are short, Heraclitean ideas. So Four Quartets starts with two epigraphs that are attributed to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. Ideas such as the unity of opposites and the flux doctrine are relevant to this poem and also to The Return. Finally, and this is our last of our major themes, meditations on time. So human perception of linear time versus the timelessness of transcendence and the divine.
The opening lines of Burnt Norton are your first assurance that there is nothing accidental about this book's placement in The Return.
Right.
So Burnt Norton is the first poem, and right off the bat, these opening lines, again, listeners, had a visceral reaction. The first lines are, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable.
Whew. Wow.
Like, already, those first couple lines, it spoke to me so much of The Return.
Well, we have Philip Gerard asking multiple times, is it future or is it past?
Yeah.
And that's changing from the poem Fire Walk With Me, which is through the darkness of future past. And here we have time present and time past, both contained in time future, right? And time future contained in time past. So this sense of being outside of linear time.
Yeah. It's got the sort of sense, going back to like our Alice in Wonderland episode, of the sort of Carolinian, Lynchian riddle speak.
It also connects with the Upanishads. And of course, the relevance to Twin Peaks, one of the most famous quotations in Twin Peaks, "We are like the dreamer who dreams," is purportedly from the Upanishads. There's this Upanishadic concept of timelessness as interpenetrating and enveloping time. So the idea of time past containing all of these as time future is, it's as if everything's just kind of folded in on itself. Time future, past, and present are this nice little rosebud, right? All folded in, comes from the Upanishads.
Yeah, and in The Return, there is this so much play with time in the ways that things are ordered and could be reordered. The fact at all that The Return is, it is a return, it's a reboot. We are going back to a show from years ago that had such a great impact on people, and these characters became so dear to them, and we're revisiting them after this time has passed.
Oh, that's really nice. Isn't it? It goes beyond the time as it applies to the characters. It's also us.
Yeah.
The viewers.
Yeah.
The next two lines, if all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. The critic Andres Wessels explained it this way, and I like this take. That there's this process in Christian tradition of sin, and then confession, and then forgiveness, and then salvation. That requires linear time. So if all time is eternally present, there is no opportunity for that process to happen. There is no confession absolution, and then salvation outside of linear time. I thought that was a cool take.
No, I think that is because, again, with the return, a lot of it is trying to work through still things that had happened in the past, trying to see if they can sort of be undone or changed. And for that to happen, we have to allow for fluid time.
And I'm thinking about Cooper in the Red Room for 25 years.
Yeah.
Does he learn anything?
Right. Because that time, it's not like 25 years as we see it.
It does seem to be a place where linear time is, I mean, he's clearly aging.
Yes.
Right? He's aged, but we don't get a sense that he has moved through time in the way that we would in this dimension.
Right. Yeah, and that's something that I think we see a lot in sci-fi and fantasy stuff in general, or like anything paranormal really, is this playing with time of, if you are in a different place, like if you're in the Black Lodge, if you're in the Red Room or something, what are the rules of time there, and how would it differ from the way that we are used to associating with it? You know, when you go to Wonderland, the time is different.
Right.
When you go to Oz, the time is different. And how,
Narnia.
yeah. I mean, really,
Yeah.
any kind of thing like that. I feel like that is one of the most common tropes in fantasy and sci-fi and things like that, where there's this separate world or realm, and time is one of the easiest ways to show that that is a different place.
In some of those examples, though, the character experiencing that alternative time still has opportunities for growth and development and change. Is that our impression of what happens to Cooper as he's in the Red Room for 25 years?
I think that the Red Room is a stagnant sort of place, and spiraling. When I think of time in the Red Room, it is looping, and because of it being less linear, it does not allow for that growth and change as much, because it's not like he's sitting there for 25 years in like a wizard tower with books or something, and he's doing a bunch of studying and a lot of self-thought. He's in this very bizarre place where it's not the time that he needs really to process how he's going to approach these situations in a better way.
Right. I think that we'll have lots more to say about where Cooper is in The Return and how it reflects in these poems.
Well, and even the lines that immediately follow those, I think, lean into that as well. The lines that follow it, listeners, are, "What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility. Only in a world of speculation, what might have been and what has been. Point to one end, which is always present."
It's so powerful, this idea of the actual past and the potential past standing in the same relationship to the present reality. So much of The Return is about missed potential,
Yes. Yeah.
lost potential, wasted time,
Right.
in a sense. And since this book appears behind Audrey's head, it's hard not to consider these lines and most of Burnt Norton, I think, in terms of Audrey.
Yeah. And also in this, there's a lot of reference to dancing as well,
Right.
which is easy to associate with Audrey and Audrey's dance. But I think that some of the things we've talked about have been that I know for me, it is really hard to see Audrey, this character that we love so much and had so much potential right up to the end, when we see her come back in The Return, and she is very much a shell of herself in ways. This beautiful, strong-minded, stubborn, I'm Audrey Horne and I get what I want. And we see her in The Return, and she's very like kind of a shattered version of herself.
Yeah.
And so we look at this again, like this potential, this possibility that was available to her, and we're like, where did the time go? And what has passed in these years since we saw this character that we love so much and we're so defensive of?
And then when we see her in her last scene and Eddie Vedder is singing Out of Sand, I know that Eddie Vedder didn't read Four Quartets in order to write that song, but my goodness, how the language echoes in these first lines of Burnt Norton, doesn't it?
Right.
That repetition in the chorus of that about, who I was, I'll never be again.
Yeah.
Who I could have been, I'll never have the chance. And then toward the end of the song even is that line, there's another us around somewhere with much better lives. The resonance with the beginning of Burnt Norton here, that, what might have been is an abstraction. And it's, it points to one end, which is always present. It doesn't matter.
That's the thing is again, like when we're thinking about potential, we're thinking about all these possibilities. We're talking a lot through these poems about time being this spiral or being fluid rather than linear. And the hope is that it is. The hope is that it is so that you can reach back and you can change things, or you could reorder things and approach them in a different way. But with the song, we're running out of time. It's like this imagery of an hourglass sand, like just slipping through your fingers is how it sort of feels. And you want those better things for your younger self. It's just time moves so quickly. And I think that's why Four Quartets and The Return can elicit such emotional responses, because it's something that everyone can really relate to. Reading this, again, one of the biggest themes that we note is that humility, because it's just being faced with your own mortality. I know one of the things I had brought up was David Bowie's last album. I mean, talk about, somebody very involved with Twin Peaks. His last album, and like the music videos that he put out at the time and stuff, it was very clear that he felt himself running out of time as he struggled to just get all of these ideas out of his head and get them out into the world, to get this music out there, get this art out there. And I feel like this is sort of Eliot's version of that. It's like, again, the same themes of mortality and humility and aging and trying to get this art out into the world. And it feels like a feeble attempt at times to just sort of like put out this very vulnerable version of yourself. And is anyone listening? Is anyone hearing this? And I feel like that kind of energy is very present in The Return as well.
It absolutely is. When you consider the age of Lynch and Frost and of the actors, and how many of the actors died during or shortly after the creation of The Return. I mean, mortality, aging, and then, perhaps regret, which is a massive theme of the Four Quartets as well. These are always here in The Return too.
Right. Yeah, it has that melancholy, bittersweet energy to it, of where we are grasping at these characters that we love that are slipping through our fingers, in the real world and on the screen.
So the poem then transitions into this interesting scene in the rose garden. And he says, footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened into the rose garden. It's as if the potential past is echoing in the memory as if it happened. So those footfalls echoing in his mind, it's like he can hear the potential footfalls.
Yes.
Heading into the rose garden. He then asks, and this is kind of a moment of humility, but to what purpose disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves? I do not know. Like, why am I stirring up the past? Why am I revisiting these memories and these experiences? So that's our first indication of the speaker of the poems, uncertainty, humility. But they head into the garden.
Yes.
Yeah. And
yes,
so,
round the corner and through the first gate.
Yeah, so it's like they're following the echoes of what might have been into the garden, and then those echoes stay there with them. So there's a whole lot of like them and they here. I like the critical interpretation that's basically the incarnation of those potential selves that are all convening in this scene in the garden at the same moment.
Which we can even just picture of the many Coopers, essentially.
Oh, yes, yes.
All of these variations of himself, essentially.
Coming together eventually in the return. This is probably a good point to mention that Burnt Norton is a real place with a real garden.
Yes, in fact.
Yeah, so it was called Norton House originally. In 1741, Sir William Keats, after a wild scandal that involved his wife's maid, it's delicious. Read it, enjoy it,
Juicy.
listeners. Juicy. She deserts him. He sets fire to the house and then dies in the house.
A bit dramatic.
It's a whole story. And the house is renamed in 1741 as Burnt Norton. Not Norton House anymore.
Burnt Norton.
Burnt Norton. Do you love that?
I do. I love it's very dramatic and I love everything about it.
And it's retained that name for hundreds of years since. Yeah, and so in 1934 or 1935, T.S. Eliot visited Burnt Norton with his former beloved, Emily Hale. She was like his first love. And so this is based on a real experience they had. They were trespassing in this garden.
As you do.
And wandered through the rose garden. And they had apparently a transcendent experience. So the speaker of the poem is in this garden, which is in the actual house of Burnt Norton, and has a transcendent experience.
Yeah.
It's described as they're looking into the drained pool. And then all of a sudden, the pool is filled with water out of sunlight. And then the lotus rose quietly. The surface glittered out of heart of light. So the scholar PS3 identifies this lotus as a symbol of ultimate reality in Hindu and Buddhist thought. And here it's associated with the heart of light. Eventually that will be connected with the still point that Eliot's going to mention in the next section and then throughout this. Yeah. So he's introducing here this idea of a kind of glimpse of ultimate reality. So through linear time, through the limits of human experience, to something absolutely real, transcendent, and in union with the divine.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the sort of keywords and themes that I noticed reading through is these references to light, which we've talked about before is a big thing with David Lynch as well, whether it's like, sort of more electrical light or if it's a more transcendent light, but that comparison between the light and the darkness, sort of duking it out, is definitely a big common theme. And I think we see a lot of it in the Four Quartets as well.
And we see so much emphasis on the importance of transcendence in Lynch's own life. I mean, he's always talking about the value of transcendental meditation and his own experiences with transcendence. Eliot's speaker is experiencing it here. It's in line with the mystical experience. That usually begins, according to Evelyn Underhill, with this almost accidental transcendental experience where you kind of see through human limits. And then that begins your spiritual journey. So it fits that the speaker of the poem's journey begins with this glimpse of something much bigger than the human experience. And it ends with the bird saying, "Go, go, go. Humankind cannot bear very much reality."
True. And I think the other thing, too, is like another connection to Twin Peaks is the amount of characters we have that have visions. And when we think about them and the way that affects their transcendence and the way they move through the world, it is a show where we are told to take visions very seriously. These like visions of transcendence, these visions of what's to come, we take them very seriously. They're not funny to us. They're serious.
Yeah, and they're transformative. So that vision, that moment of transcendence, you can't stay in it forever. Human beings are not built for it, like the bird says here. But it changes you permanently.
Yes.
It changes the speaker of this poem permanently. And then, and Evelyn Underhill talks about this in mysticism too, is like, how do you reconcile your ordinary human life then with what you've been privileged to glimpse? Like, how does it change you? How do you connect back? How do you make meaning out of anything else?
Yeah, I'm thinking especially of like Major Briggs. Like, how do you deal with those visions and not have it change you forever? And then when he shares his vision with Bobby, how that changes the trajectory of Bobby's character. We all see this great arc in this character where he, and I think that that is a big moment of it, where it's like, okay, so now that you've had this vision, what are you going to do with it? And he chooses to follow it. He chooses to believe that that is a path for him.
Yeah. I think throughout the original series and The Return, characters experience transcendence in their own unique ways.
Oh, yeah.
Very true to real mystical experience.
Yeah.
You know, it's a humorous one, but certainly Nadine and her listening to Dr. Jacoby, you know, that affects her transcendence.
Right.
You know, his angry tirades.
Right. And that's even like how he's sort of processing moving through the world. And it's like, as people have these different journeys, you know, Major Briggs is affecting Bobby's, Jacoby is affecting Nadine's, you know, how we talked in the last episode with Wally. It's like Wally sharing his journey and his information that he has affects other characters as well. Because again, that also feeds into the spiral. It feeds into this idea of everything being very fluid and connected. You know, people are sort of, it's like a domino effect in a lot of ways with a lot of different characters.
Well, and speaking of that domino effect, probably everyone's favorite one is that Ed and Norma, thanks to Nadine's experience of transcendence and her transformation, are then able to have their own. So this makes me, though, very hopeful for what happens to Audrey.
Yes, yeah.
Over the course of The Return. And I think that we'll be exploring that a lot more in the next sections of Burnt Norton. So this idea of transcendence will have some bearing on where we end with Audrey too.
All right, listeners. So at this point, we're going to be moving along to section 2 of Burnt Norton.
So section 2, the first stanza starts with these patterns, these earthly patterns that connect with celestial ones. And some critics see this as patterns are a consolation for our inability to perceive timelessness as humans, or a way to search for it. So when we're outside of that moment of transcendence, we're looking for that experience in the best place we have as mere humans with our limited perception, and that's in patterns. It's an interesting take. But the thing that really has bearing, I think, on The Return is the description of ascending to summer in the tree. We move above the moving tree and light upon the figured leaf, and here upon the sodden floor below, the boarhound and the boar pursue their pattern as before. The critic P.S. Sri in Upanishadic Perceptions in T.S. Eliot's Poetry and Drama talks about the Upanishadic symbolism of two birds in the same tree of life. So one bird acts while the other looks on. So like one bird is low down in the tree. It's the bird of the earth, basically. And it's eating and it's just experiencing. And the other waits in the topmost branch. So above the tree, very much connected to the symbolism here.
Right.
And that lower bird eventually perceives that its struggles have just been taking place in the shadowy world of appearances within time, which is Maya. And the lower bird, you know, is that ephemeral self. once it recognizes that it's kind of like eating, drinking life is just part of this illusion, this part of the world of Maya, it wants to reunite with that upper bird, the spiritual kind of connected, the higher bird, which is the eternal self. So when we think about that core idea of the return of the dreamer who dreams and then lives inside the dream, that's another way of expressing this idea in the Upanishads of like the higher bird is in a sense the dreamer, right? And that lower bird is the one living in the dream. The reason I think it's interesting is not just because of that connection to the dreamer who dreams, but when Ed and Norma have their lovely moment at the end, think where the camera takes us. It goes right up into the sky from there, which could be a deliberate symbolism from the Upanishads. Of like that transcendence taking us up off the earthly world, away from the lower bird,
Right. Well, and I think it's not even just in that we see there's many beliefs where there's this idea of like the higher self, the the sort of enlightened self that we're always sort of striving for. It's like what we do in our life on this earth is all with this like focus and hope towards achieving that upper self. And then below that, we've got these lines that I really love, which is a clear reference to, again, that spiral and the still point. These lines, at the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point, there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement.
And do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered. Neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point. There would be no dance, and there is only the dance.
Which is when we start getting into dancing.
Yeah. This idea of the still point of the turning world, this is where the human mind, the human consciousness has access to the divine or to like timelessness. And so Eliot's going to refer to this still point a lot.
So I think first off, again, a big part of this that really reminds us of Audrey is the dancing. And this is kind of one of the big first references to dancing being a huge part of this symbolism.
And it's so interesting because it's a lack of movement, but it's also a dance. And so this is when we're talking about Heraclitean ideas here, this tension between paradoxes. Heraclitus believed that it was the tension between opposites that kept reality together. So the idea of both stillness and the dance, perfect for that. Audrey's dance, though, in The Return is quite still in a way.
I mean, even going back to in the original show, the way that she dances, why we call it Audrey's dance, why people remember it. Like, you can say that to a Twin Peaks fan and be like, show me Audrey's dance, and they know exactly what to do. It's a very particular, deliberate form of movement that it's very fluid, but it's generally keeps you sort of in one place. Like, you're not moving around that much in comparison to, like, I don't know, if you just told somebody dance, they probably would do something quite different than that.
Yeah, right. We don't usually associate dance with stillness, except in ballet. And Eliot was an enormous fan of the ballet. In particular, he was a huge fan of the dancer and choreographer Václav Nijinsky, who one of Nijinsky's innovations was stillness in ballet. So if you're a fan of the ballet now, you know there are those moments in dance where the dancer poses. Usually the central figure holds a pose. The scholar of dance, Susan Jones, described this as, the moment in dance when the body is apparently at rest and all visible movement is stripped away. There's only that centered stillness of the figure. But that is not a passive or static pose at all. Every muscle is engaged, and the moment is full of potential. It's like the possibility of movement fills the stillness, and the mind is reaching within, toward, and beyond an apparently temporal confinement of the body. That's her description, but I love it.
Yeah. Well, I remember when we were first sort of sitting down with notes, we had talked about that, where it's like, I did ballet when I was younger, and it's true. That is honestly often some of the most difficult times, and that plays into that sort of opposites as well, where you look incredibly still, but you are pushing every muscle in your body to hold that pose. To appear that still actually takes incredible control and can be a huge strain on the body. All of your muscles are working like crazy in that moment.
Yeah, so it's not a pause, right?
No.
As Eliot says, it's do not call it fixity. That stillness is the dance itself.
Yeah.
Right? It is the dance, which is a wonderful tension. And it's a resolved or reconciled paradox. It is dance and stillness at the same time.
Right.
And that's where Audrey is. Audrey's dance is perhaps the thing that creates her transcendence, that affects it.
Because again, we've talked about how that the way that our characters transcend is deeply personal to them as well. And so, of course, why would it be anything else than that for her? Like, this is the thing that we as viewers, as fans, associate with her. And so, of course, this would be the thing that can sort of lift her up and out.
It is her access to the still point of the turning world. Yeah, it's her access point. And throughout Four Quartets, Eliot will explore different ways that humans can access this still point. Once we've experienced that glimpse of transcendence, we're always searching for how to access it. So perhaps Audrey's is just the physical dance itself.
Yeah. Well, it's the same way that that dance is meditation for a lot of people. It is something that's meditative. With Wally, he says that his dharma is the road. For him, driving, riding is the way that he transcends. Everybody has something different, that is the way that they approach their meditation. That's where they find their center, where they find their calm, and are able to fully work through these things in themselves to be able to transcend.
And Audrey finally finds hers.
Yeah.
Which gives us so much hope for what happens to her in that moment of waking up in that white space, kind of shocked and horrified.
Yeah. And then, so after those lines, we also have some really powerful ones. I can only say, there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. Again, we're coming back to this idea of like, if you were to place it in time, that would mean that time is linear. That would mean that time is not fluid, which we know that it is. And Eliot is trying to remind us of that. It's just that another reminder of like, you can't just like place yourself in time. You can't just like drop in wherever you want. It's not just a timeline that you can just hop around.
Right. No matter what Cooper thinks.
Unfortunately.
Right. The lines that follow that are borrowed directly from the Bhagavad Gita. The inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion. We'll probably talk more about that when we get to the dry swages, but here, even in Burnt Norton, he's introducing the language of the Bhagavad Gita. He does that a little bit further down in this remainder of section 2 when he says, to be conscious is not to be in time. That line also seems to come directly from the Gita.
Yeah. And then jumping back up, just sort of back to sort of the middle of this page, there's some lines I really love. I'm just going to jump in sort of partway through. Concentration without elimination, both a new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror. Yet the enchainment of past and future, woven in the weakness of the changing body, protects mankind from heaven and damnation, which flesh cannot endure. And then we get the repeated line, time past and time future. But I think that there's a lot of references in this poem, again, just to the humility of mortality, of the body changing. I just really, those back-to-back lines of it's partial ecstasy, it's partial horror, because it's the classic thing that people say where it's like, it is a privilege to age. It really is. There are characters in Twin Peaks that do not get to age, like Laura, really.
Yeah.
I mean, like there are characters who are lost along the way. And then there are characters who do age and then are faced with that. And it is a lot for them to take on. And I think that ecstasy and horror is a good way to sort of show that spectrum of aging.
No, that's very well said. And then that following with time past and time future allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time. You know, we human beings living in linear time, as we face our mortality, we just get so few glimpses of eternity or of timelessness. We have so few moments of transcendence. And then I love how Eliot resolves this, in a sense, or attempts to, by saying, but only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbor where the rain beat, the moment in the drafty church at smokefall be remembered. We don't know what those other moments are. He's told us about the moment in the rose garden. My assumption is that these are small, tender moments that he really treasures in his own memory. Yeah. And he's saying, without linear time, we have no memory. We have no ability to experience these tiny, treasured moments of our lives. And so the value of linear time is access to these memories, you know, of things that have become very dear to us. Right. The Return and Twin Peaks, the original series, is so full of these kinds of things too. For all of its lofty explorations of mysticism, spirituality, what grounds us, I think, as viewers, what maybe makes us love it even more are these small moments, you know, the moment in the rose garden, the tenderness between characters, a funny interaction. And only within time do we get those.
As you were saying that, the first thing that popped into my head is the classic picnic video. The way that is such a tender moment that is captured in time, captured in the video. And we come back to that scene often. The video is played, we're reminded of it often, and I think that that particular moment is such a little capsule, and it's so precious. It's Laura having a good time. It's, you know, seeing her and Donna being so free and young. Every time I see, you know, an image of that like pop up from any of the accounts I follow that just post a lot of, you know, screenshots and stuff, every single time there's a bit of like a pang in my heart when I see images from that. That's one of those soft little moments in time that we as fans are holding on to, that the characters themselves are holding on to.
And isn't that the moment that David Lynch fell in love with the character of Laura Palmer and the actress Cheryl Lee as well. I think it was making that little video.
I think it was because, originally she was just supposed to be the dead girl.
Right.
She was just supposed to be just in these, past little blips. But then he realized how much potential there was to make such a full-bodied character out of it. And thank God he did, because I don't think any of us could imagine. The first time I heard that, I tried to think what it would have been like if she wasn't as present in the show, or like if there hadn't been Fire Walk with Me. And that's just not possible.
No.
She really embodied that character in a way that was so real, and you fell in love with her instantly, which is exactly what Laura was to be. She was supposed to be this girl that everyone loved, and it was so hard to watch her performance as Laura and not immediately feel that love and protective energy.
Yeah. And so this, we could add this, the moment at the picnic, to this little list of moments that Eliot is saying, only in time can these moments exist.
Right.
And thank heavens they do, because then they impact eternity.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then to end out our section 2, the last line is incredibly powerful. Only through time is conquered.
Yeah. One interpretation of that, just, as the poem itself, is that we can't perceive timelessness if we don't perceive time first. So the reason we're able to have those transcendent moments of perceiving and appreciating timelessness is because we live in time.
Yeah.
Because we usually are in linear time. At the very beginning of Underhill's book on mysticism, there's an epigraph from Rudolf Eucken that says, man is the meeting point of various stages of reality. So man is the meeting place between nature and the spirit. And so we, human beings, uniquely are able to perceive both. The world of nature, the temporal world, and then the ephemeral, or the spiritual world. So I think that's cool. Like, this only through time is time conquered. Like, only as temporal beings do we have the ability to perceive timelessness.
Yeah.
How do you see it as connecting to the return?
I think that the way that this really ties in with the return for me is that, like, again, this is a return. This is, we're coming back to these characters and to these places, and time has passed. Characters have learned new things. Well, some of them have. And the way that we can conquer this time is through time itself. Time has had to pass, and we also have to sort of go back in time and confront things, and sort of dig up the past in ways to confront where time has led us now. It's like when we think about like time travel and things like that, pretty much any narrative where there's a character who is performing time travel, it is because that they're trying to address something in the past to fix it for the future. Like, that's kind of the narrative, the trope, when we encounter media that has to do with time travel. The return also takes us back into the past, just visually, to show us things that have led us to where we are now. And that kind of knowledge is also how we battle the current state of things too. It's knowledge, it's experience, it's time, it's growth.
And I think one thing that's interesting is when you're describing the way the other characters experience this, like, only through time is time conquered. It's a figurative sense. And then Cooper at the end of the return does it literally.
Yeah.
And without humility.
Yeah.
He presumes to know that he can use time to basically conquer time, or believes that he can. And I know we'll have a lot more to say about this later, but I like this, that he's the only one, perhaps, who interprets it literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because also, as we were saying, the way that he is spending his time,
In the waiting room.
he is not learning. He's not spending that time necessarily learning or changing, while other people are experiencing that more linear time on Earth. They are having those years go by, and they are experiencing, like, our beloved characters that are just in Twin Peaks living their lives and growing and changing as they age. They have learned new things. They have gained new experiences that have led them to where they are now. And even there have been new characters brought into this world. There are characters that have been born of characters that we love since then, that play an important role. But because Cooper is sort of denied that, traditional sense of aging, he's still that upstart, hopeful young man that he thinks that he can do it. He thinks that he, with enough hope and certainty and bravery, he can fix this.
Mm-hmm. And yet he's in an old man's body.
Yeah.
As he's doing it. As you were saying that, I was thinking about the characters who we love, but we see them stuck in patterns, like Shelley, perhaps stuck in patterns of pursuing the wrong man.
Yeah.
Ed and Norma seem to be trapped in a pattern as well. But unlike Cooper, we have a sense that there's always hope of them breaking out of that pattern. With each loop of the spiral, with each loop of the pattern, you are learning more things.
Right.
You know, and there is always an opportunity then to exit that pattern.
Right, because the thing is, as you're being confronted with these situations again and again, you are hopefully learning from your past experiences how to better navigate them in the future. That is what we all can only hope as we age, is like, okay, so when I was younger, I would have dealt with the situation in a very different way. And I think because Cooper doesn't have that time on Earth to have that normal aging process per se, he's not like Ed and Norma, who have lived these many years and seen how they're navigating things and going like, okay, like something needs to change, something needs to happen here.
And when that moment comes for them, they know exactly what to do.
Yes, because they've been waiting and preparing for it.
Right. Once Ed gets his freedom, he acts immediately. He doesn't think about it.
Right.
And Norma doesn't think about it.
Right, yeah.
It happens right away. It makes me very hopeful for Shelley then.
Yes.
As the last scene we see of her is like gazing at them and smiling.
Right.
Maybe that's her access point as well.
Well,
to the still point.
Yeah, because when we think about talking about spirals and cycles, we think about the cycle of abuse and how Norma is very much like a motherly figure for Shelley. And so when she's seeing the ways that Norma is in relationships, they're not healthy relationships. Well, not necessarily with Ed. And then, but same thing she's seeing with Ed and Nadine. She's seeing all of these examples of unhealthy relationships. And then what is she going to go do? Especially when she entered into these situations very young, and then she was in an abusive marriage, and then what is she to do with that information? And then we see the way that it affects her own daughter.
There's still hope for Bobby and Shelley.
Yes,
I'm choosing to write my own ending there.
I'm choosing to write my own fanfic there.
They lived happily ever after.
Yes, they're very good to each other, and they're having a great time.
Well, section 3 of Burnt Norton takes a dramatically different tone, and Eliot introduces it by saying, here is a place of disaffection, time before and time after in a dim light. So it's not time present and time future or time past, it's time before and after. So that already changes the tone. We get a kind of flatness or emptiness to the time here through that description. And the light is dim. It's neither daylight nor darkness, which would purify the soul. So we have almost a purgatorial kind of feeling to section 3. I personally react to this as the state that we see Audrey in when we first meet her in The Return. That home that she's living in with Charlie feels to me perfectly described by the language of section 3.
Yeah, because again, that's, as we sort of said earlier, I think it shocked a lot of fans seeing her in that state because, you know, time's going by and we're all like, oh, I hope Audrey's doing well. Oh, we love Audrey. Hope she's like, you know, a girl boss now or something. And then we see her and we're like, oh, what happened to you? Why are you there? Why are you with this guy? Why are you here? What?
And why are you so angry and raging over nothing? You know, the lines, only a flicker over the strained, time-ridden faces, distracted from distraction by distraction, filled with fancies and empty of meaning, tumid apathy with no concentration, men in bits of paper whirled by the cold wind, and so on. Just this emptiness and meaninglessness of this existence that she seems to be trapped in. And then the time-ridden face. Yeah. You know, last we saw her, she was a spectacularly beautiful young girl.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
You know, and here she is now, obviously older.
Right.
And clearly confined in some sort of, I don't know.
She's in this like difficult situation that we are, again, like shocked to see her in. She's kind of this fractured version of herself. There's something very broken about her in the ways that she's got these like bursts of emotion and the, you know, the atmosphere around her is very heavy and unpleasant, uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think too, because we can't read the events of Four Quartets linearly, it makes sense to say section 3 is where we meet Audrey, right? Then we go into section 2 for the dance.
Yeah.
And then to section 1 of Burnt Norton for that transcendence.
Yeah.
You know, these are not meant to be read as linear events in Burnt Norton, but I think we can see them matching up with the stages of Audrey's experience.
Right, yeah, as we circle back, as we spiral around.
Right before Audrey appears in part 12, Jacoby is finishing one of his tirades and he says, the ninth circle of hell will welcome you. I think that's the line. Other fans have noted that, you know, Dante's circles of hell, like you sink into the ice. And that Audrey, when we first see her, doesn't move from the waist down, as if she's kind of trapped. I don't think Audrey is in hell. But there is almost a self-inflicted punishment that she seems to be going through here, that she's in this purgatorial state, which is this utter misery. That it lines up with some of the lyrics from Running Out of Sand too, and that like the, you know, victim or witness, we're going to get hurt, that there are echoes of wrath, like God is our witness, but he won't testify. This feeling of abandonment. Yeah. And loneliness and just being cut off and kind of trapped. You know, I think that can go. We know that Audrey's in this state because she was a victim. Right. But don't victims often propel themselves into a spiral of self-blame and self-hatred and self-punishment and torment that lasts long after the pain of the actual event?
Yeah. You know? Well, even just before we started recording, we were talking about seeing that in Blue Velvet. It's really a common theme. It's unfortunately a very true theme as well. It's not just something in TV and movies. This is something that, you know, statistically happens very often.
And we see it with Diane.
Yeah,
also.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and as we talk about, you know, being in the sort of state of purgatory, we talk about Dante's circles and stuff like that. Okay, so the spiral, are we descending? The next lines are descend lower, descend only into the world of perpetual solitude, world not world, but that which is not world, internal darkness, deprivation, and destitution of all property, desiccation of the world of sense, evacuation of the world of fancy, and operancy of the world of spirit. This is the one way, and the other is the same, not in movement, but abstention from movement, while the world moves in appetency on its meddled ways of time past and time future. So we descend. There's a grittiness to it. There's a darkness to it. We're not in this beautiful rose garden anymore. But again, time is fluid. So is this before? Is this after? Time before, time after. But the diction here is very, I mean, of course, it's very deliberate. And so the word choice is very interesting because we've got these, intense words like deprivation, destitution, desiccation. These are harsh words, and they set a grim tone.
And it's an emptiness and abandonment, and yet it's a way of hope. So it's through descending lower that we perhaps, he says, this is the one way. So this is one path to exiting this. It's one path to the still point, perhaps. Whereas that previous world that's described, the place of disaffection, there's no escaping that. That twittering world that he describes previously. That's just kind of a loop that no one exits. Descending lower might give us an access point.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too, because it's like oftentimes when we think about like, just literally how therapy works, it's a lot of confronting things in your life and how you want to grow and change from things that you've experienced, from ways that maybe you used to act or things like that. It's often like confronting. I mean, that's a common theme with Lynch too, is confronting the darkness with the light, the shadow self. And at this point, we're going to move on to section 4. This one is a pretty brief section in comparison to the other ones. So we don't have a lot of big notes on this one per se. But these last two lines, we've got, after the kingfisher's wing has answered light to light and is silent, the light is still at the still point of the turning world. Again, these references to light and the still point of the turning world.
And it's a good transition for us into 5, where he's going to contemplate that still point a lot more and identify some key things about it here. Okay, so section 5 begins in the first stanza, what seems to be a kind of meditation on the function of art. He talks about like that which is living only can die. Words after speech reach into silence. Only by the form, the pattern, can words or music reach the stillness. By crystallizing notes into music that can be written down and replayed, by arranging words into a poem, that's when you can kind of capture these things which are fleeting into a kind of permanency. So again, that tension between opposites, again, that tension between the temporal and the timeless. But here in art, like as an artist, and since we're connecting this with a masterwork, of David Lynch and Mark Frost, I think it's very fitting, this idea of moving these eternal ideas or concepts into art. Eliot's meditating on it here, and I think to some extent our creators do that in The Return as well.
Yeah, well, and also just mentioning the idea of, again, like transforming it through music and stuff. music is a big part of Audrey's dance as well. So of course this is going to be a part of her transcendence. It's also, it's the movement and it's the music. The very first lines are words move, music moves. And in fact they do for Audrey.
Oh, so they move a person as well.
I think so.
I like that. So one reading of that is Eliot's talking about these things move themselves through time, but also they have the capacity to move us emotionally or perhaps even, psychologically.
Yeah, I
in
think
Audrey's
so.
case. One thing I find kind of charming in this section is Eliot's reflection on how difficult it is to make art, and write. And he says words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. It's very hard to create. It's very hard to make art.
And especially when you know that your time is running out,
Yes.
especially because it is like you've just got all of these like voices and ideas inside of you struggling to get out, all these characters, all of these metaphors, like everything that you've got, in this like quarry in your brain of things to mine away, all these ideas. And it's like, oh my God, I've got to get this out. And I am faced with my own mortality, trying to get it out as fast as I can, which again, we see so much in The Return. It's like not all of our characters were able to be there.
Catherine Coulson almost not.
Yeah.
That's
Just barely.
Such a good example of that, like the urgency of recording those scenes as that person is dying.
Right. Yeah. It's like this frantic urgency. I think especially these lines, slip, slide, perish. Like there is like a frantic quality to that of like, I'm trying to get this out. I'm really trying to get this out.
I know it's in Room to Dream when Lynch talks about working on The Return and how, and saying to his wife then that like everybody else on the project was so much younger than him. And, he's putting in these very, very long days and trying to keep up to create this work of art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because that is the struggle. Like, again, just talking about mortality and aging, it's your body is not the same as it was back when you were, just putting out your first works.
He seems then to meditate on critics, maybe within and without, saying shrieking voices, scolding, mocking, or merely chattering always assail them. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation. That, it's like as you're in the process of creating this work, you've got the inner voices and the outer voices all equally mean, trying to tear you down and convince you.
And was he wrong? Because as we found, people originally didn't love this.
Right.
People were originally very critical of it. And that is like part of what is so hard too with and honestly, we see it with The Return as well. There were a lot of people that because Lynch had more, power to really make it his vision, a lot of people who were familiar with Twin Peaks, but not with David Lynch, were like, what am I looking at? What is this high art, nonsense or whatever? And it's like, but all any of us that were Lynch fans were like, oh, of course. Oh, David, But really, it had very mixed reactions because anyone who wasn't familiar with his style per se came to The Return just thinking it was going to be like a quirky, cute, fun reboot of this old show, and they get into it and then they felt alienated, and then they took to the internet to say, well, what was this? What was this? What was I looking at?
This stanza ends with the crying shadow in the funeral dance, the loud lament of the disconsolate chimera. A chimera has a lot of different meanings as a word. I personally like the meaning of an illusion, especially an unrealizable dream. That one resonates for me, not only in the context of this poem, but in The Return as well.
Yeah, I see a lot of Audrey in that line.
The disconsolate chimera is her unrealizable dream.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just like the crying shadow in the funeral dance. I think in my first read through, that was one of the first things I underlined in this section. because I was really looking for like the keywords of the dance and stuff and thinking about Audrey as I was reading this, especially because of it being, that's how we see this book in The Return is through Audrey. So I feel like on my first read through, I was particularly reading it through the lens of Audrey. And I read that line and I was like, just picturing the image that came to mind was just a forlorn Audrey dancing. And yeah, and then that line that follows it right afterwards as well.
So the last stanza of this section and of Burnt Norton gives us for the first time a pretty clear definition of what Eliot perceives as the still point, as access to the still point. First, he alludes to the figure of the 10 stairs. This comes from St. John the Cross's idea of the 10 stairs on the mystic ladder of divine love. And importantly for the purposes of this poem, it's love that motivates every action of the person on each step. So love is the motivation the whole time. And he goes on to say, desire itself is movement, not in itself desirable. Love is itself unmoving. Only the cause and end of movement, timeless and undesiring, except in the aspect of time, caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. Love is the still point of the turning world. That fits with the Eastern idea of Krishna being the still point of the turning world and Krishna being love. But Eliot seemed to believe that human love, romantic love, is an access point to divine love. So, this whole poem begins with his reflection on this experience at Burnt Norton with his first love. In Lyndall Gordon's book, T.S. Eliot, An Imperfect Life, he describes this moment as the rapport between Hale and Eliot is so acute that the ghosts of their former selves seem to walk towards a moment that transcends love with a glimpse of eternal love, the still point of the turning world. So for us ordinary humans, romantic love is one way that we can access the divine, one way that we can exit the trap of temporal life and transcend. Ed and Norma do that.
I was about to say, yeah.
We see characters who have loving relationships throughout both the original series and The Return. The Briggses stand out as a loving couple in the first seasons. Lucy and Andy's love for each other in The Return.
Yeah, there's they have such a glow to them, I think, at times. And also, this is not to say that they don't have, disagreements or quarrels or things like that. But there is, at the end of the day, this genuine love for each other that I think sort of surpasses any of that.
There's a real harmony between them. And we see that, their disagreement over the chair. That it takes Andy giving into Lucy, and then Lucy gives into Andy.
Right.
And they both win, and it balances.
Right, which is such a perfect example of like finding that balance and peace with each other.
But I think we see the opposite of that with Cooper, and I think this begins to predict where we see him end up at the end of The Return. Cooper turns his back on love.
Yeah.
He has a family who loves him and who he loves. Is there a hint here that could be his access point?
Right.
That love of Janie E. and Sonny Jim, right? But instead he creates a doppelganger.
Yeah.
To experience that love in his place.
Yeah.
And then he moves about without humility about the errand he thinks he's destined for.
And I think that is potentially part of why he does not succeed, is the universe was like, here is your way. Here is your access point to love, to the still point of the turning world. This is how you can transcend, is you have found your place in love. And he says, no, I'm not finished with, I'm going to go back. And I'm going to do this with the idea that time is linear and I can just jump back through this timeline in a certain way and then I can shift everything.
Yeah.
And time was like, no,
No, you can't.
you can't.
Mm-hmm. He uses a sexual relationship with Diane, it seems, in part to also transcend, right?
Yeah.
This idea that some version of human love, but Diane's despair at that moment, and also the fact that she has abandoned him by the time he wakes up, suggests that, again, he's going about it the wrong way.
Yeah.
He's later, I know in this poem, it's going to say, like, we miss the meaning. That there's this idea that he's going through the right motions, perhaps, but something fundamental is missing, or he has abandoned it.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I feel like the universe is trying to give him these paths. It's trying to say, like, here, 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 and shuffle him towards it. And that's the issue, is where his lack of humility, because he can't just make peace with his humility. He is getting himself further and further away from the ultimate goal. He thinks that he knows what's best. He's like, I know what I'm doing. I know what my path is. And the universe is like, no, please, this way. And he's like, no, I know what I'm doing. And because of that, he pays for it.
And yet so many of the other characters we see in The Return are truly humble.
Yeah.
Or have been humbled by the past 25 years of experiences, have been reduced into, disappointing circumstances.
Right.
And that humility that they're experiencing has given them the potential, the access to transcendence, to escape.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, again, like, thinking of the characters that we do see transcend, I think that all of them, like Nadine, it's like she's sort of giving up, a lot of things that she was holding on to for a long time, like by the skin of her teeth or whatever. It's she's really finally sort of making peace with things, and that humility is what allows her to transcend.
One quotation I really loved from the scholar Marianne Tourmalin. This was from her book T.S. Eliot at the Turn of the Century. Much that is said in the quartets is tentative, but love is the central immutable power, the heart of the still point, the heart of light. Nothing temporal can touch it, but it touches us everywhere, in and out of time. I think going forward for the rest of the poem, it would be nice to keep that in mind. Love is one of the few certain things. It's the central immutable power. Even as the speaker of the Four Quartets is very uncertain, he's just exploring and trying to figure things out. That remains a constant there at the still point.
Yeah.
I like thinking about that in terms of The Return, too, that to some extent love could be the still point of that artwork as well.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
And then just the last few lines of this section and of the poem are really powerful, I think. Quick now, here, now, always. Ridiculous, the waste sad time stretching before and after. It's kind of a gut punch.
It is.
I mean, I think there are a lot of lines in this that felt like a gut punch while I was reading through the first time and second and third. But yeah, again, we're looking at time as this. I love this, like, now, here, now, always. I love that little part of it a lot, because it has a very, it has the fluidity to it, but it's kind of holding you too. Because it's now, it's here, but it's also always. And ridiculous, the waste sad time. Ugh. And again, thinking about, like, mortality and the fear of, like, running out of time, running out of sand, and the ways that time passes us by, like, do we feel it's wasted? Do we feel it's sad? Or, do we think of it fondly? Do we cherish it? Or do we feel good about it? Like we spent our time well. The time that we had, we used it well. And it's stretching before and after.
What do you think is contained between before and after in that last line?
I think the first thing that came to my mind, like my gut reaction answer, is actually, so I think we've mentioned before, or if we haven't, listeners, I have a lot of experience in tarot. And one of the most common and popular forms of readings, like if you go to somebody for a reading, most likely they'll give you, like especially if you're at an event or something, they'll give you a 3-card reading, and it's your past, present, and future. And that is one way that we can one way to look at it is linear. Obviously, you're laying these cards out in a line, but time is a lot more fluid than that. So a thing that I really love with a different form of reading that I do is there's a different kind of deck called Lenormand. And the thing that I love about Lenormand, as much as I'm always going to love tarot, but a thing I really love about Lenormand is that it's a lot more fluid. The cards talk to each other more. They're a lot less, fixed. And so when I do a 3-card reading with Lenormand, those cards are just talking to each other. It's not past, present, future. They are all overlapping. And they're all speaking together, sort of in unison, rather than in these, very fixed states. Also, one of the first and few times that I've gotten a reading from someone else in tarot, I felt particularly moved by the cards that were pulled for my past and future, because they are ones that just narrative wise, it makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting. Is the past card was the Fool card, which is a card of new beginnings, of learning from your past mistakes, being very brash and excited, adventurous. And then my future card was the High Priestess, which is a card of great knowing, of knowing yourself. When we're talking about the enlightened self, that is a card that encompasses a lot of that energy. And so when people ask me about, I got them tattooed.
I know. I
Yeah.
remember this. I was smiling as you were telling this story.
Yeah, I have them tattooed on my thighs because I found that reading very particularly interesting and moving to me, because I think that it's a good idea or a good reminder of where I've come from and where I aim for. I come from the things that I've learned, my experiences, the mistakes that I've made, the things that have made me who I am, and I should never forget them. And my past is constantly growing. My before is as recent as 10 minutes ago, as recent as a second ago. That's the beauty of sort of mixing fluid and linear time, is that that is always changing. It is changing as I'm speaking. And my future is also very fluid because my future is what? Now. It's my future now. And my future in 2 seconds from now.
Yeah.
Or it's also 20 years from now. And so I have them there to sort of ground me. They are my before and after. And I am also living my present. I don't have my center card tattooed on me because my present is constantly changing. I'm living in my present.
I see.
The before and after is always, always changing. Every single second it changes because time is passing, but also time is fluid. So to say, my before was who I was when I was a kid. Well, that's part of it. My before is also who I was 10 minutes ago. And we are always changing and growing, and that is constantly affecting that before and after. We're living in our present, and our present is always slipping through our fingers and always growing.
When you're describing those two different kinds of cards, I'm connecting them with Eliot's language here at the end, he's using the before and after, which is different from the time past and time future. He seems to see time past and time future positively and as kind of nestled, like I said at the very beginning, like that rosebud, right? Like the petals kind of encasing each other, where this stretching of time before and time after is clearly a linear time.
Yeah.
Where he's saying, like, in one way of reading this is these abstract formulations of before and after are ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, that's what the ridiculous waste is like seeing time this way. So I'm very interested in how those different kinds of card readings you were describing seem to represent those two different ways of looking at time also.
Yeah, I think it's the tarot would be, in my opinion, the more linear. The Lenormand would be this more fluid idea. But even then, at the same time, again, I like with my tattoos, I think of them through a fluid lens. I think that it's constantly overlapping. I think that to approach it in only one way is also to commit it to a fixed state.
So could this also predict one of Cooper's problems by the end of The Return? That he wrongly assumes that the before has not been changed, that time past has remained static, that he can just dip back into it and revisit it and change it.
I think so, because sort of going back to what I said before, that's the classic blunder of the time traveler narrative. That is the classic mistake that is always made. They go back to try to change something, and it always goes awry. It's never a perfect answer. It's never what you think it will be. They try to change something, and it affects something else, or time will just find a way to undo that. I've read a lot of great time travel novels where the concept is that no matter what you do, time will find a way to just undo that and rewrite it so that the outcome is still the same. But there's also ones where people do succeed in changing that one thing, and then there's a crazy butterfly effect afterwards. They come back to their present, and the world is horrifically different. There's no way to win. When you are trying to change time. I think that is the common narrative that we often see with anything like that. You cannot just go back in time and change something and have it work out for you. Unfortunately, that is just the way it is.
We're going to end our discussion of Burnt Norton and, frankly, of Four Quartets today. We've realized that this took much longer than we expected.
We got very into it.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to lead toward our ending with this quotation from William T. Moynihan. Again, he said that time is redeemed, psychologically at least, in the Four Quartets by accepting memory, the past, while one moves toward desire, the future, while controlled by love, which is the constant now of the present. In his perception, this idea will not be substantially altered in the successive quartets. It will be tested, weighed, and enriched, however, in prolonged meditation. I like this idea that the key to progress, at least one interpretation of it here, is acceptance of the past, moving toward the future while controlled by love. Again, it's that idea that one way of accessing the still point is through love. Also humility, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, isn't that what we see of Audrey? She admits that she needs help.
Yeah.
She says to Charlie, "Get me out of here."
Yeah.
And it's that break in her armor. It's that vulnerability that then is the last thing we see her say in this other world.
Which I think, thinking of the spiral too, that goes back to what we know of her character. She often puts on the brave face, gets herself into difficult situations where she is then pushed to her limits and forced to ask for help.
And at the end of The Return, when Cooper says, "What year is this?" and leans forward and looks very broken, maybe, if we want to feel hopeful for him there, it's that humility that then allows Laura, Carrie Page, to hear that voice and then scream.
Yeah. Well, listeners, that is where we leave off with Burnt Norton. Originally, with this episode, we had planned for it to get into East Coker as well, but we had a lot to say, and maybe didn't realize quite how much we wanted to get into this one. But this is also probably the poem that we had the most notes on, and saw the most resonances with The Return.
I think so. And we have also laid the groundwork for a lot of themes and ideas that we'll reference again with the other poems. So I feel comfortable cutting off here.
Yeah, this way we don't inundate you too much. As always, follow us online. We are on Instagram. We also encourage you to reach out, whether it's on Instagram or you can also email us.
We'd love to hear your comments, your insights, your ideas, especially as it relates to this poem.
And with that, we'll leave you, listeners, with
It was Laura.
And she's come to kiss you goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye.
Gary, I have no idea where this will lead us, but I have a definite feeling it will be a place both wonderful and strange.
It was Laura, and I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
Do you want to phrase that in a podcast voice?